Before Sean Combs was a business mogul and rap artist and producer, he was just a kid from Harlem.
It's really surreal. It's really overwhelming to come from New York.
I'm taking a look at some of the shocking details Combs has revealed about his childhood and what it could mean about where he is today. Sean Combs, of course, has been all over the news for the last month following his arrest on sex trafficking and racketeering charges. He, of course, has pleaded not guilty to those charges, which came after raids on his homes in Miami and LA in late March. Combs' world started to crumble nearly a year ago when his ex, Cassie Ventura, filed a civil lawsuit claiming Combs subjected her to a decade of physical, mental, and emotional abuse. Combs settled that suit the very next day. Since that time, more civil suits have followed, with claims being made that Combs sexually assaulted or sex trafficked at least a dozen women. Combs has denied all of those allegations. Stories about those lawsuits have been the subject of hundreds and hundreds of news stories, and it's not the kind of attention that Sean Diddy Combs is used to or wants. He had cultivated an image of a self-made billionaire and business mogul for years. Combs had used a number of names over the years: Puff Daddy, Puffy, P. Diddy, Diddy, and now Love. But what do we really know about him as a person and how he became who he is today? What shaped him as a person? I want to go back to the very beginning. Sean John Combs was born on November 4th, 1969 in Harlem. His mom was Janice and his dad was Melvin. We're going to have more on Melvin and Janice in just a bit, so stay tuned. We know Janice eventually moved Combs and his sister to Mount Vernon, New York after Melvin died. Janice actually worked 3 jobs to put them through private school. In a 2006 documentary, Sean Combs, Portrait in Black and White, Combs revealed a lot about his upbringing. He explained the difference in how his grandmother raised him compared to his mother, telling a story about someone stealing money from him after his grandmother sent him to the store to buy cigarettes. His mom told him to go get the money back and not to come home unless he got that money. He left crying, found the guy, and got beat up, but he said he got that money back. In the documentary, Combs said, "My mother, I guess, was raising me for the real world. She always told me, if someone hits me, to hit them back harder." Combs' father, Melvin Combs, was shot and killed on Central Park West in 1972, but for years, Combs actually believed his father died in a car crash because that's what his mom told him. Combs talked about his father in the documentary, saying in his own words that he later found out his father's brains were blown out, and he learned he was the son of a hustler and a gangster, which he had always suspected. There has been talk over the years that Melvin Combs worked for Harlem gangster Frank Lucas, whose story was depicted in the film American Gangster. Combs apparently found out his father was friends with Frank Lucas, that drug dealer in the area, but has said in other interviews that his father was actually a drug kingpin in his own right, which is something he didn't want to glorify. Lucas has said he and Melvin Combs did business together. Combs said his only memory of his father was him tossing him into the air. He was a very stylish dresser. The ladies loved him. His whole everything is real meticulous. He had a lot of drive, a lot of determination. You know, he ain't want to be poor. I spoke with Sean Sotero, a music journalist, earlier this year about Sean Combs and his father.
The Melvin Combs story is very interesting. I found something actually just the other day. You know, it's a daily news story from February 1973, which is a few years, maybe a year and a half or so after he was killed. But it was around the time that this drug case in which he had been involved, in which, you know, finally convictions happened in it. But this article says, well, look, you know, this case, which was, you know, breaking up a giant heroin ring, started when Melvin Combs's phone was wiretapped. And that was sort of the break in this case. And the article doesn't out and out say this, but it seems to imply that Melvin Combs' death was somehow connected to that, right? And you hear rumors people associated with Harlem in that time have said, well, look, people mistakenly thought Melvin Combs was an informant and that's why he was killed, right? It's sort of something that people who knew him back then or who knew the area back then have said. And so, you know, it seems to me this article sort of trying to put 2 and 2 together and say maybe the reason they thought that was because there was in fact, you know, this wiretap on his phone. So that part was true, but obviously wiretaps are not something one does voluntarily, right? So if this Daily News article is to be believed, I think that maybe sort of explains the story behind his death, possibly. But yeah, I think, Diddy definitely had the image of his father was very important to him. There was a speech he gave at Howard, maybe 2005 or so, something like that, where he recalls very vividly, I was in college at Howard, and the first thing I did was go to the library and look at the microfiche and look up the Amsterdam News and see this story about my father. Like, it is something that is very important to him, this image of his father as sort of the drug dealer, but not just the drug dealer, sort of the suave, powerful guy who hung out with, the biggest of the big gangsters, right? Frank Lucas, like you mentioned, who, of course, his story is now immortalized in movies, right? He's about as famous as you can get in that sort of milieu. So I think that Diddy seemed to hold on to that image of his father, and it seemed very important to him that his father was someone big and notable and important.
Combs also discussed being a somewhat lonely person and his belief that he's not a good friend. I don't really think I make a good friend. I don't think I'm someone who someone's going to call when they're going through something. I don't think I'm going to have the patience to really slow down to give them the attention they need. There are other things that Combs revealed about his childhood that really make me wonder what's going on with him when it comes to his views on women and sex. Combs spoke in the documentary about how he lost his virginity when he was just 12 years old. Combs also talked about watching pornography at a young age. The first time I had sex, I wasn't scared. It felt so good to me, but I just remember how impressed I was because I used to watch Midnight Blue and how I felt I was just as good as the porno stars, like in Midnight Blue. I want to bring in Dr. Daniel Bober. He is a forensic psychiatrist who deals primarily with young people. So, Dr. Bober, your first thoughts on this documentary? We have Sean Combs years ago talking about being really, quite sexually active at what I think is a young age.
Yes, I agree. And I think, it's important to state the fact that those who are abused or exploited or have inappropriate sexual encounters at a young age are not necessarily going to go on to become abusers. In fact, the majority don't. So, Sean Combs would not be the first person to have a traumatic childhood, but that certainly would not absolve him of responsibility for his acts.
He speaks so vividly. I've kind of talked to a number of people about this, just bouncing it off of people. Like, what do you think of this? Like, he's talking about losing his virginity at age 12, being exposed to pornography, watching pornography at a very young age. And there have been some people who have said to me, like, oh, come on, like, it's no big deal. A lot of kids do that at that age. I think of 12 as being very, very young. And I think of that as being a very formative time period and something like where that could shape the way you look at sex. And viewing pornography at such a young age seems to me, and I know he's pleaded not guilty to these charges, but the allegations are that he has these days-long sex parties, and it could go into a lot of different things looking at this. Is it possible he's just got these kind of wild views about sex and things of that nature?
So I think what's going on here is, first of all, it is a big deal. It's not no big deal. So being exposed to sexual experiences at such a young age is definitely a form of trauma and abuse, in my opinion. People who are exposed to those types of scenarios when they're that age can go on to develop a number of symptoms. They may have problems with intimacy. They may objectify women. They may have a fear of vulnerability. They may be hypersexual, or on the other side, may be sexually avoidant. So it is not no big deal. It is something that can make it is something that can have a prominent effect on someone in their terms of their relationships and their sexual development. But again, it doesn't necessarily speak to the things that he's accused of. It may be an explanation for why he engages in some of the behavior. But I think if you take those childhood experiences and you combine them with celebrity, and then you have a person who has very deviant ideas about sex, combined with being a celebrity, acting with impunity, knowing that there are no consequences, or at least believing that there are no consequences for their actions, doing so without fear that something's going to happen to them because of their tremendous wealth and their celebrity. And so I think that is a malignant combination.
There's also the viewing of pornography here too. This is another thing where I've bounced this off of some people, and they're like, "Oh yeah, no big deal." But children viewing pornography, even adults being pornography, I'm not trying to sound puritanical, but there are a lot of people, and you're an expert in, you're in forensic psychiatry. Is that a bad thing, the viewing of pornography? I mean, especially for a young person who's a kid.
I do think it can be bad. I think it's totally inappropriate. But unfortunately, with widespread access to the internet, to social media, kids at younger ages are being exposed to this type of pornography. And I have seen situations where patients of mine, for example, have acted out sexually at an inappropriate age, at least associated with the fact that they were viewing pornography. So I think it could be potentially destructive, but it really depends on the kid, their temperament, their parents, their support system. So I think there's tremendous variability.
There's another piece of this puzzle too, and that's drug use. And drug use is alleged to have been rampant here. There's talk of GHB, ketamine, cocaine. There's allegations in civil suits being made that Sean Combs's staff kept him basically drugged up all the time. Like, it's almost as if they were instructed to do so. How does drug use kind of influence these behaviors? I mean, I think of drug use as kind of loosening one's inhibitions and things of that nature.
So certainly drug use can make you disinhibited, affect judgment, affect your insight, affect your ability to control your impulses. But as we know in criminal law, drug use in and of itself, voluntary intoxication, is not a defense for a crime. What I see his defense team doing right now is painting this sort of family man defense, because one of the accusers is a single adult woman living at home and he is married with children. As a society, we place a positive moral value on either being married or having children or both. And the fact that this is a single woman, I think they're using that to sort of prejudice people, if you will, or causing them to view her in a negative light because he is this sort of pure family man and she is this single adult woman. And again, I think there's sort of a subtext there that in some way he's morally superior because of that.
Well, they've also said too that his defense attorney, Mark Agnifilo, has said this was consensual. You might not like it, but these were consenting adults. That's kind of what he said publicly too. So it'll be interesting to see how they play that at trial. He's also said he will testify. There's another thing about Sean Combs's upbringing too that I find interesting. It's actually quite sad in this documentary. He talks about how, his mom, taught him, like, if somebody hits you, hit them back harder.
Right.
And you got to be tough and you got to hit him back harder. And I'm sure, growing up in Harlem, at least for the first part of his life, was not easy. That was rough. And she moved them out of there to try to get them into a better life. And kudos to her. But then there was this discussion about, getting the money stolen and, having to go out there and fight. I mean, it's, oh my goodness. Like it's like you want to kind of put your arms around the young Sean Combs and hug him and take him in.
Listen, no question about it. He's tremendously talented. He's changed the world. He brought himself up from very difficult circumstances. So like all things, people are not all good or all bad. But that doesn't, excuse his conduct. If in fact these things are true, then he engaged in criminal conduct. But it doesn't take away from the fact that he had a difficult childhood, that he's an enormous talent and success. And we've seen this happen with other people before, like Michael Jackson. These are people who, again, that millions of people listen to their music and have found moments of happiness listening to them. And then we find out something about them that tarnishes that image, and we find ourselves conflicted about whether we should still be listening to them because of these acts that they've been accused of committing or have committed.
Yeah, I feel like, he had it pretty rough in some respects. Losing his father too. He didn't have a father figure, and that's often very important. It's important to young men, to boys, to have a father figure. His father, of course, was murdered.
Oh, no question about it. Again, and all these things affected him, I'm sure. But the fact is that a majority of people who are exposed to this type of loss, trauma, abuse, neglect, don't go on to become abusers themselves, although certainly it increases the risk significantly when compared to the general population.
A slew of bombshell lawsuits could soon reveal some A-list celebrity names connected to the infamous P. Diddy freak-offs. But before these suits are filed, some celebs are rushing to settle, all to keep their names private and out of the Diddy conversation. And with literally thousands of accusations against Diddy and more than 100 civil suits coming down the pipeline, how will these alleged offenders be able to keep up? And if these startling accusations are true, could they face charges? We'll break it all down with former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi. Now, it's been a busy month for 54-year-old Sean P. Diddy Combs, who spent the whole of October behind bars on federal charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. This comes after more than a dozen civil suits were filed against Diddy, alleging he was a kingpin in a sex trafficking scheme that lasted decades. The civil suits and federal indictment all lay out a similar pattern. Diddy or his associates drugging victims, often sexually assaulting them, forcing them to have sex with prostitutes, and filming all of this. These scenarios were dubbed freak-offs by Diddy, and that term was listed in multiple civil suits and in the indictment. The feds say they have recordings of this too, and that's what led up to Diddy's arrest. So we know for sure Diddy is somehow featured in these recordings, but there are also rumblings that other high-profile names were caught on camera too. We got this info from Houston-based attorney Tony Busby. He's the lawyer behind more than 100 civil claims against Diddy that are expected to be filed over the coming weeks. This week alone, 7 civil suits were filed listing Diddy as the defendant. The allegations range from 1995 to 2021, with multiple accusations of rape, one of a minor. And according to Busby, more lawsuits are on the way, with some major celebrity names also attached. I talked to Busby just one day after he announced the suits and asked him about these celebrities.
A lot of people are talking about names that could come up in these lawsuits. You referenced that some of these names are pretty high profile and could shock us. What can you tell me about those names? Are there a lot of people that could be implicated in future crimes? Is it possible that the things that will be listed in these future lawsuits could be prosecuted? What can you tell me?
Well, I'm very careful to talk about whether someone did or did not commit a crime. The civil system is very different than the criminal system. The criminal authorities are very particular about which claims that they pursue because the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. In the civil system, the standard of proof is more likely than not, or preponderance of the evidence. So it's a lot lower standard in the civil system. But to answer your question as far as crimes, I won't comment on that. But as far as whether there will be additional individuals, people that we all know joined in some of these suits, there's no doubt that will be the case. There's no doubt that some of these events and these assaults occurred at particular people's homes, some venues, some hotels, some clubs. We know that there were people in the room when some of these things occurred. It's my view that if you participated in it, if you benefited from it, if you encouraged it, if you watched it go on and were somehow involved, whether it be even peripherally involved, and did not try to stop it, especially with regard to minors, then it's my view that you have liability on the civil side. So that's what we're looking at. And obviously we want to be very careful about who we name because, I don't want, an error in that respect is not good for anyone. And I'm not going to be the person that starts naming names of potential people and smearing people for no reason, because the case is about credibility. So I have made sure that each of these people that we represent currently are people that I'm proud to represent and I believe in, and I believe in their case. But I want to make sure that we include every potential liable party when we file the case.
These names that will be included, the ones that you are willing to include in these suits, why will they surprise us so much? Is it because they're beloved people in the Hollywood universe?
I've gotten this question so many times, and I know, and you're doing your job, obviously, you want to know who they are, some kind of facts, so you can kind of figure out who they are. I think I'll just leave it at this. I mean, it was a secret that everyone knew about what was going on with regard to these parties and some of the things that happened in these so-called after parties. There was a pattern in practice, custom of behavior that went on for many, many years. The MO of how it went down was pretty much the same for many, many years. It typically included, people identified and specifically invited to certain venues and parties. When they showed up, they were given a specific drink. They were made to drink it. If they didn't drink it, they would many times be kicked out of the party. And a lot of these folks would drink this drink that was provided to them and literally could not remember hardly anything that happened thereafter. And the next morning woke up disheveled, injured, confused, scared, ashamed, full of guilt, and wondering what in the heck happened to them. Some of them, of course, have clear memory about what happened, but could not stop it from happening. It's incredibly egregious, especially with regard to those that were minors at the time this happened. And it's my view that if you were around and you were there and you were watching this and in some way participating in this, you're complicit. It's one thing to, obviously, anybody that was directly participating in this, in my view, should be under the jail, but that's not my decision to make. That's the authorities. My job is to find and ferret out all the people involved, facilitated, benefited from, profited from, and make sure that they are parties in these cases as we file them. And there is a long list of people. I've said, and I'll say it again, I have no doubt that there are people right now who know that they were somehow involved in this, who are now scrubbing their social media, who are searching their memories, who are deleting their texts, probably deleting pictures, and trying to distance themselves from this. And we know who they are, or we will find out who they are. So, this is not something that's going to happen overnight, but I think we're at the tip of the iceberg here.
Busby has already sent demand letters to these celebrities, and some have settled outside of court before these lawsuits could even be filed. That means their names may never be public. So how does all of this work? If there really are incriminating recordings of these celebrities, could they face charges too? Here's where we have to bring in former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi. So our focus today is talking about these major celebrities who apparently were involved in some of these freak-offs, P. Diddy's alleged sex trafficking scheme. And now some of them, there are reports that they're settling outside of court before we know their names. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're delaying the inevitable. The ones who are settling, they're probably getting non-disclosure agreements, which are fine, but those become blossomed and exposed to the public, if you will, if there's a court order or subpoena, because that information, among the parties will be private, but if there's a court proceeding, they may have to disclose who they are and things like that. But I will say this: if I were a celebrity or public figure that had any contact with Diddy and all these freak outs and all the other explosive events, they should be panicking. And settling is probably the best thing, but it's going to delay the possible inevitable, because an aggressive federal prosecutor or group of them is going to try to get a hold of those names and the people who settled.
Yeah, I think you and I have actually talked about this in the past, because there have been these allegations that some A-list celebrities are involved in all of this. And I mean, they have to go back in their memory bank and think, I was with P. Diddy, I was at this party. Okay, it might be recorded. It might be out there somewhere. So what do you think these people are doing? I know we talked about settling, but do you think they're also retaining their own attorneys and kind of bulking up their team in that way?
Oh, the people who may be involved, if they are not getting attorneys, they should have gotten one yesterday or a month ago. And if they don't get an attorney, then they are really in harm's way, because they could be subject to possible indictment, possible charges, but at best for them, they could be corroborating witnesses, even if they did not engage in these freakouts or whatever you want to call them. They may have relevant information regarding themselves, what they observed, or they could provide leads to the prosecutors.
I know you talked about the aggressiveness of these federal prosecutors because it's the Southern District in New York. They're the best of the best. And so they're probably going to be referring to these lawsuits, kind of reaching out and seeing who these people are. And you alluded to this, that they potentially could be charged. These celebrities whose names we don't yet know, they could be charged. What would all of that look like?
Well, here's the thing. If I were the prosecutors, and I worked in the Eastern District of Virginia, so I consider that the best U.S. Attorney's Office. But the Southern District is a close second. They are brilliant. And there's probably 4 key prosecutors on this case. I don't know if they're going to add more defendants because you want to keep this indictment clean. It's sort of like the charges against President Trump. He's the sole defendant. If you bring in other people, you have motions to sever, you have conflicts, things like that. So they may be added as unindicted conspirators, but not defendants in the caption. So if I were the prosecutors in the next few months, and this May 2025 date is ridiculous, it's going to be pushed back. They are probably going to continue to do grand jury work on potential additional victims, additional conspirators, and they may be named in the indictment, but not put in the caption as a defendant. So that's what I predict. You're going to see at least 1, 2, or 3 superseding, amending indictments in the next few months, in my view.
Do you think it's in the best interest of these celebrities who they themselves know they were involved? They may have even spoken with an attorney in regards to these civil suits that have yet to be filed. So these people who know that they were part of it, do you think it's in their best interest to reach out to federal prosecutors and say, hey, I'll tell you everything I know right now and work alongside you?
That's an outstanding question. The only way that's going to happen is if the person in consultation with their attorney have concluded that they were part of a conspiracy and they in fact did things that violated the federal laws. In that case, they may want to reach out to stop the bleeding or delay the inevitable because they're eventually going to get a call from the federal prosecutors. But it depends on how much information their attorneys think inculpates them and puts them in harm's way. But if they don't have any strong legal exposure, if I were their attorney, I'd say lay low, don't reach out, let them come to you. But if there is strong evidence, I would call the prosecutors because it's going to come that they will be added at least as an unindicted conspirator.
And you mentioned your prediction about no defendants being added to this, only P. Diddy, because that makes sense. The feds want to go after him. He's the kingpin in all of this. So potentially not another defendant in these celebrity names that we do not yet know. But do you think it's possible that down the line, this Diddy case is completely over, a verdict has been ruled, all of that then the feds could go back again to these people who weren't initially charged and then pursue legal action then?
I do, but I think the more practical thing is they're going to build their case and focus on Diddy. But at the same time, if they have people that should be charged, they're not going to add them as a defendant in this Diddy case, but they may work out charges in a parallel project to get them to cooperate and to be witnesses. And if they testified at the Diddy trial, they would be offered as an unindicted conspirator of Diddy. That may be the way to do it. Going after them after Diddy is concluded, there's less incentive, and here's why. The prosecutors have their trophy, they have Diddy, they can put it on the wall, end it. Close it down and just move on to another case.
Now, we don't know the specifics yet. I know we're all dying to hear the names and how these people were involved and to what degree.
But just a basic question about all of this. If they were there, they witnessed a crime, they can see that something is going wrong, a person's being drugged, or there's a minor, there's a rape, whatever it is. Are these people compelled to report that?
No. There's a concept called misprision of felony. And if I witness you, Sierra, robbing a bank, and I'm across the street, and I saw you come out of the bank with a gun and the money, I don't have a duty to report that to police. However, if I attempt to conceal what I just observed, that could be considered misprision of felony. But if they just observed a crime and did nothing else, there's no duty for them to report other than their conscience and their moral compass.
And again, we're not sure exactly to what extent these people were involved. It does seem like it was more than just witnessing it, but that remains to be seen. We'll circle back to that when we know more. As far as the allegations against Diddy, though, there are these new civil suits. There were 7 filed this week alone. There's more than 100 that are expected to be filed over the next couple of weeks. And some reports say that thousands of people were sexually assaulted by Diddy and have come forward. So at the very least, is this daunting to these other people, these celebrities who are involved, if they want to go and settle and get their names out of the lawsuits? I mean, doesn't that seem like a big undertaking?
But the attorney, Tony Busby, has a daunting task in herding all these cats, if you will, these lawsuits. So I would not, if I were him, I would not go above 120, 130 lawsuits, because at the end of the day, you're facing the law of diminishing returns. The other people that may be victims, they can be used in those cases as leverage. But for Mr. Diddy, or for Diddy, I gotta say his legal fees are going to be through the roof, and he's probably going to have 1, 2, maybe 3 law firms representing him if he can get that to work out. Because these lawsuits, these other lawsuits besides the indictment, it's going to be like handcuffs on him when it comes to his criminal trial, a total distraction. And here's the worst thing about these civil lawsuits: discovery, depositions, interrogatories, all this information that these lawsuits are going to gather. There's nothing to prevent the attorney for the lawsuits to turn that over to the prosecutors. That would be a benefit to the Southern District of New York on a grand scale.
Also, talking about the allegations that people are pointing out, we can kind of infer that Diddy's team is going to say, hey, this was consensual. It may be weird or unconventional, but it was consensual sex. We can just assume that they're going to be doing that. But what if these victims, survivors, were minors? I mean, that completely changes things, both in terms of Diddy and these celebrities who may have been involved in all of that. Does that make things more severe?
Absolutely. Because if your victims, if you will, are 18 or over, and they're not under statutory age, Mr. Combs, also known as Diddy, can make the argument, you know what? I was a weird guy. I had perversions, and you may not like it, but this was all consensual. It may, it's on video. I embrace it, but it was consensual. I never forced people to do this. They were all in. But if you have, Sierra, victims who are underage, 12, 13, 14, there's no defense. And you can't argue consent. That's why they have laws that set a minimum for consent.
That's what's shocking to me about all of this, if we're talking about the federal indictment against Diddy, is that he's not charged with anything about sexual assault of a minor. I mean, he faces 3 severe charges, but nothing about kids. I mean, I'm really surprised that the prosecutors didn't bring that. Do you think that they may in the future?
Yes, that's why these civil lawsuits, Sierra, are so vital. Those lawsuits may gather information that there are victims underage. And if that's the case, and the prosecutors get a hold of that, then you really will have a quick superseding indictment. And if they get underage victims, alleged, and once again, he's presumed innocent, if they have alleged victims, that really raises the stakes for Mr. Combs.
So we've talked about it kind of as a
through line of this entire interview that the prosecutors are paying attention to these civil suits and potentially talking to the plaintiffs, the attorneys involved, kind of investigating. So you, as a former federal prosecutor, what would all of that look like, that they're going through and doing this investigation while they're also at the same time pursuing Diddy? I mean, how does all of that work?
Well, I had a crooked pain doctor. He was egregious. And while my indictment was pending and we were preparing for trial, at the same time, there was a civil suit against one of the pain doctors, by one of the pain doctor's patients who died of an overdose. So that civil suit was conducting discovery and actually conducted a deposition of my defendant. And my defendant did a deposition. I used that deposition in my legal criminal proceeding against the defendant. So that's how it can help the prosecutors. The civil attorneys are doing the digging. They're interviewing witnesses. And at some point in time, if they get good information, they're going to call the prosecutors if the prosecutors don't reach out to them.
The bottom line of the story we're focusing on today is about these celebrities, because everyone wants to know the crimes that Diddy is accused of are shocking. The fact that he's this high-profile name, but now that there may be other A-listers, obviously everyone's really interested, to say the least, to find out what may happen to them. Now, we know that some of them have settled ahead of time in an effort to keep their name out of the news, but as you've pointed out, it's possible that we would still learn their names. What do you think the likelihood is? Will we have a big reveal of all these celeb names?
I don't think you're going to have a big reveal, but you're going to have water torture in a sense that a name will come out today, maybe 3 days from now. And here's what I predict: even if you have NDAs, you're gonna find out who signed those NDAs, and it's not going to be a secret, even though there's an NDA. So we're going to hear names in the next few weeks. I guarantee it, of potential individuals who have been sued or for whom there's an NDA. I predict that these freak-offs, these events that Mr. Diddy had with other people, that we are just getting the tip of the iceberg. I think you're going to see more videos come out, more recordings, more photos. So I think it's only going to get worse. He didn't just wake up last year and have these events. He's been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years. He just has this part of his life, part of his culture, where he has a strange habit, if you will, and hobby of doing these events. And you're going to see more and more information come out. It's not going to stop.
Diddy has pleaded not guilty to all the charges against him, and after his arrest, his attorney Mark Agnifilo released a statement reading in part, quote, "Sean Diddy Combs is a music icon, self-made entrepreneur, loving family man, and proven philanthropist who spent the last 30 years building an empire, adoring his children, and working to uplift the Black community. He is an imperfect person, but is not criminal." To his credit, Mr. Combs has been nothing but cooperative with this investigation. Please reserve your judgment until you have all the facts. These are the acts of an innocent man with nothing to hide, and he looks forward to clearing his name in court. Right now, Diddy's federal trial is scheduled for May of 2025, but ahead of that, he's due back in court on December 18th.